Hi there. Okay, my name is Brooke, and this is a test recording that I'm making because I was invited to present about Steiner in the context of Christian philosophers and also Christian Existentialism by David, who runs the Freedom Convo podcast. And I was really excited about this opportunity because um, Steiner has come into general public awareness in a different way in the past 5 years, in part because of some awarenesses or predictions he made back in the 19 teens or 1920s about things that would happen at this period of time, specifically that there would be a vaccine that would intend to drive out the soul and spirit from the human being. And so David very kindly asked me to, or invited me to speak about Steiner in the context of some other Christian philosophers, which is cool because often we don't think of Steiner in this context, but it is accurate. He was a philosopher first. So the this preparation that I'm doing is something I do anyway to prepare to present a topic, and I'm recording it because who knows, maybe I'll publish it as a separate standalone piece. So first, let me describe what anthroposophy is. Anthropos Sophia. Anthropos is human being, Sophia is wisdom, so it's wisdom of the human being. This is the term that Steiner used to describe the worldview that he brought in. And this worldview, in and of itself, is a spiritual worldview on the human being and the earth and cosmic evolution. It is not necessarily Christian, but the further you go into it, the more you realize that Christ is at the center of it. So it's Christian in the cosmic sense, or it's the cosmic Christ. It has a view of the human being as a microcosm of the macrocosm, and so there's great amounts of information presented about the human being and all the spiritual components of the human being. These being, we have our physical body, which everyone can see or touch or hear or whatever, but we have also many subtle bodies. And Steiner defines these in ways that are similar to other traditions that came before. He uses very specific definitions and he uses very specific sort of delineations and terms. Trying to get into anthroposophy requires learning a lot of terms. And so I will describe some of the basic terms in this presentation. The other thing that I want to explain is what esoteric Christianity might mean in this context, or esotericism in general. Esoteric just means hidden. But the idea, at least at this point in time, is it's not hidden deliberately. It's not hidden by a secret society. It's all out there, but it's only available to people who study. So the same way that higher mathematical forms are not hidden, they are esoteric because I'm not going to understand them unless I study them. It's the same with this version of esoteric Christianity or esoteric spiritual understanding. It requires study to understand it, and that study is significant. I wouldn't discount it at all. I happen to have grown up in a situation where I was exposed to anthroposophical ideas from a very young age, but then on my own, when I was young, like 22, I found it to be the spiritual stream that made the most sense to me, and so I took it on, and so I've been studying it personally for over 20 years, and that's, um, I think it actually takes that long before one might be comfortable talking about it in public, or that's how it would be for me. An interesting thing Steiner said about esoteric Christianity is that basically standard Christianity is not enough for some people, and that's how I feel about it. I find it to be true, except that it doesn't have the depth, breadth, and detail that I need when I'm trying to understand the world and spirituality and religion. And so that is why there are these other versions of Christianity that have all this detail and complexity. And it's because for some people, standard Christianity just is not enough. It doesn't speak to their rational, intellectual, and developing spiritual side. There's a certain innocence and acceptance that is required for a lot of versions of what I'll call mainstream Christianity or exoteric Christianity. And I have not found that needed in trying to make sense of the version of Christianity that I've come to be associated with. So let's start. Here we have Rudolf Steiner. He was born in 1861 in what is now Croatia. He died in 1925 in Switzerland. He was first a philosopher. He was not a religious teacher or speaker in any way. He was clairvoyant from childhood, and I'll talk a little about what that means in his context. But he had a PhD in philosophy, and he was pursuing a philosophical teaching practice until he was about 40. He brought forward this concept of anthroposophy. And in these pictures, I've shown several of the books that he wrote in the early part of his philosophical teaching and then in the early part of his spiritual teaching. So Steiner came to the understanding that he had a deep clairvoyance and also a deep spiritual background as a young man, because even as a child, he had clairvoyant experiences. Now, clairvoyance is a term that's used in anthroposophy. Rarely do people say psychic. It has a lot of overlap, of course, but clairvoyance is shorthand because we also have clairaudience and clairsentience and all these other clair analogs of the physical senses. But for simplicity, we'll just use the word clairvoyance. And in Steiner's case, it meant a very precise and controlled awareness of information that was not physically available. It also, in this context, always means something that is not achieved in a trance. One has to have day awake consciousness to have this modern type of clairvoyance. Steiner also followed some, let's say, spiritual laws. One of them is that one should not become a spiritual teacher until reaching the age of 40. And so in this list of his written works, we see that there's a very definite change in topic as soon as he reaches the age of 40. And the law of continuity, which means one must connect one's work to prior traditions. We human beings don't live in a vacuum. And so we need to, if we have strong abilities, we still have to connect them to prior traditions. Now, in Steiner's case, which was in Germanic countries in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he had accepted this mission of reintroducing the concepts of reincarnation and karma into Christianity. And the only people who were interested in hearing about that at that point in time were people who were studying theosophy, meaning with the Theosophical Society. And so he had to begin his work with people who asked questions. A true spiritual teacher is not allowed to teach unless a question is asked of them. And the people who asked those questions of Steiner were members of the Theosophical Society. It ended up that his group of people and himself split from the Theosophical Society in the early 1910s because of a disagreement about the second coming of Christ. So what we can see on the left-hand side of this list, books 1 through 7, are Steiner was working within a philosophical context. He was highly immersed in Goethean studies, Goethean knowledge. He was an editor of Goethe's scientific works, and he also studied Nietzsche's works. So, and then on the right-hand side, you see the books that were published after Steiner turned 40, and after 1902, they are all about these spiritual matters. The book called Mysticism at the Dawn of the Modern Age was a transitional piece, and it is a historical work looking at a whole variety of mystics from pre-Christian and post-Christian era. And just one note about the titles of works, because all of Steiner's work was in German. Sometimes titles are translated very differently, and that is why I put down the date. It can be hard to tell for sure which book you're looking at unless you look at the date or the GA number, which I'll describe in a minute. Okay, so speaking about Goethe, Goethe was a major inspiration and influence for Steiner's work. And as Steiner said, the spiritual science that he was bringing forth, or spiritual knowledge, in German, the term for science has much more of that meaning of knowledge than it does in English. And so it could be better understood as a rigorous understanding of a body of work. So spiritual science is a term that Steiner used to describe his work in tandem with anthroposophy. And as he said, it presupposes a natural science that corresponds to that of Goethe. Now, Goethe's natural science was, it is a precursor to phenomenology. So it is all about finding out the truth of the object observed from the object itself. So it's objective, and it's nearly a spiritual practice of observing the thing that one wants to understand in as much detail and without pushing oneself onto it, so that the thing in itself reveals itself, which makes it a contrast to Immanuel Kant, because Kant came to the conclusion that we can never know the thing in itself, and Goethe indicated that through this Goethean science, I don't have a term for it other than that, through this phenomenological approach, we can actually receive information about the spiritual thing in itself. One of Goethe's insights was something that he called the Urpflanze. I'm sorry, my German pronunciation is not great, which is like, we can understand it as the archetypal plant. And Steiner described this as an example of Goethe reaching something that we can call living thinking or etheric thinking, which is thinking that's in motion and can see every part of the potential all at the same time. And so then we move on to Christianity and how this interfaces with anthroposophy. Steiner typically referred to the Christ resurrection story as the mystery of Golgotha. And while Steiner himself grew up in a Christian background, he was not particularly religious as a child or a young man, and really came to these insights on his own when he was, I believe, in his mid to late 30s. And he began talking about them after that. A couple different things to understand about this. Steiner gave many lectures on Christianity, probably hundreds. And I've pictured some of the books that I have and have read. But so I'll just talk about a few things. One thing that is relevant to the conversation about faith and reason and existentialism is this idea that I first understood from Steiner, which is that in the Gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is something that we might call active faith. Jesus Christ says to people around him, your faith has healed you, or your faith could move mountains. And this is very different from our colloquial use of the word faith, where we say, I have faith things will go right, or I have faith in God. If you really spend time contemplating this, you see that this active faith, your faith has healed you, your faith can move mountains, is a force, and it is something that is active. It is not a passive belief. And so when we compare that to the Old Testament, we have the stories of Job and also Abraham and Isaac, which are, those stories are really hard to understand because they feel like the Jehovah God is testing the faith of these characters in a very harsh way. And yet, if we look at what the meaning of these two words are, active faith from the Gospels and the Old Testament faith, we can see that semantically they are very, very different things. So one of the ideas, of course, in Christianity, which is brought out more or less in different streams, is that the incarnation of Christ in Jesus is a completely new era. And so the Old Testament stories are our history, but they are not how we live now. Now we have the opportunity for the active faith. So, and at this point, it's useful to talk about the second coming, which is actually the reason that the Anthroposophical Society split from the Theosophical Society. The Theosophical Society in Germany or in Europe had come to the conclusion around 1910 that a young boy who is Krishnamurti was the second coming of the Christ. And Steiner knew that was not true. And so he had a very definite split with the Theosophical Society. And actually, Krishnamurti himself later in life said, "No, I'm not the second coming." So the second coming, as Steiner describes it, is actually in the etheric realm. So Steiner believes that that Christ has already come again in the etheric realm of the earth. So there will never be another physical incarnation. And the etheric realm is the realm of life. It is everywhere. We all have an etheric body, which is our life body. And this is nearly the same meaning as the understanding of chi or prana. It is the aspect of our incarnation that keeps us alive. Without the etheric body being attached to the physical body, we are dead. Just like, here's a crystal. This does not have an etheric body attached to it, whereas I do. And a plant does. And that's how we can tell the difference between living and non-living objects, is what in anthroposophy is called the etheric body. Okay. In Steiner's teachings, there is actually a great deal of focus on developing what is the modern clairvoyance. And this is understood as a different and like leveled up version from the old clairvoyance, which is called atavistic clairvoyance. And there are people who still have this old clairvoyance, but it hasn't been developed through their own free will. So this modern day awake clairvoyance is developed through one's own free will, and it is never in a trance, and it is something that one chooses. It's also called the cognitive path. Steiner gives a whole variety of cognitive exercises that are designed to develop control of thinking, feeling, and willing. And the idea is that by developing a controlled thinking life, one can eventually move that down to the heart area, which allows for the heart thinking, which is sometimes called living thinking or etheric thinking, which is the brain-free thinking. These exercises, though, that are given in several of the books, such as How to Know Higher Worlds, Theosophy, and Esoteric Science, they're very simple exercises, but they're difficult to do. And they are mostly contemplation exercises. So, for one, it's observing a seed and really, while observing it, thinking about the fact that that seed, if it's a true seed, carries within it the potential for new life and more seeds. And if a, a, a replica, but not a real seed, were placed before you, it would not have that potential. And there's plant observation, there's animal observation, and then there's observation of growing and dying, or of blossoming and withering, so that we can start to understand the difference in these forces. I've noted no breathing exercises, and this was perhaps more relevant in the early 1900s, when, in the context that Steiner was teaching, because there was this growing awareness in the West of Eastern paths that included a lot of complicated breathing exercises. These were recommended against. And this does not mean, of course, like we shouldn't breathe deeply and breathe healthfully, but the focus on the breathing exercises was considered more appropriate for earlier evolutions of the human physical existence. And Steiner differentiates between these stages or versions of what I'm calling here clair awareness, because clairvoyance, of course, refers to seeing, and we aren't just talking about seeing. He calls these stages imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And these are not to be understood in their colloquial sense. Imagination has a lot in relation to uh, lucid dreaming, though, again, those words are not used. That's my take after studying it. It is becoming awake in a visual world that has meaning. Inspiration is hearing the voices of the other beings in our presence, and intuition is the unification or merging with them, because that's necessary to fully know something. These also analogize to these traditional stages of spiritual development, which are known as purification, illumination, and initiation in the language that Steiner uses. In traditional Christianity, the last stage is called deification or unification. So purification is very easy to understand. It means setting out on a path, taking care to do right by yourself on a physical and emotional and spiritual level, and, you know, not being too ascetic and not being hedonistic, and walking the middle path. Illumination is the stage where one starts to see the spiritual aspects of the world around one, and see the light, the spiritual light of the world around one. And initiation in this context is the ability to truly make sense of the spiritual world and to understand the spiritual beings that are not physically visible. This initiation is not the same meaning as some human-made ritual. In a lot of these kind of fallen esoteric forms, such as, you know, Freemasonry or any of those things, there are initiations, but that's not what we're talking about. Initiation in this context is a spiritual event. It does not involve another person doing something. It is, yeah, that's the best way I can explain it, because other than that, I don't know. So this is a simple version of the information about the human being that Steiner describes, and you can see how it relates to Christ. So we have the physical body, which everyone can see and touch, or people who can see, and you can touch and you can hear. That's the physical body. Generally speaking, yeah, there's no question about that existing. The etheric body is the life body, also called prana or chi. It is the thing that makes something alive. So plants have an incarnated etheric body. Animals have an incarnated etheric body, as do people. The crystal, again, does not have an incarnated etheric body. The astral body is the big, very complicated thing that is consciousness. And we can spend a lot of time talking about all the components of the astral body. This is incarnated in animals and in human beings, because there's no question about animals are conscious, human beings are conscious. But it's incarnated in very different stages. And there's always, because everything is in an evolutionary process, there's always transitional stages. So you might say, oh, some plants have some kind of consciousness, and that's true, but they don't have the same kind of consciousness as my dog. There are different levels of consciousness, and that's what we're trying to point at here. So the astral body in anthroposophy is also called the soul, and it is differentiated into the sentient soul, which is just awareness like an animal has, the intellectual soul, which most people that you ever meet will have fully incarnated. It's their ability to be rational and intellectual. And the current stage that we are all working on is called, in anthroposophy, the consciousness soul, which is, the way I understand it, it's the inner ability to differentiate between, to find the true and the moral of one's own path and of true reality. In the past, in the Old Testament version, human beings were not at the stage where they could determine out of themselves what was true and good and moral, and that's why the laws came from above. In the New Testament, which we live in now, human beings are developing the ability to know what is true and moral and good out of themselves. And so the laws, they don't go away, but they are not just given from above, they come from within the human being. The astral body we call soul, and then the highest aspect of the human being is in this series called the spirit, or the I, as in the letter I. And that is the drop of the I am. So it's given through the Christ incarnation. That possibility is given through the Christ being entering into the earth evolution. And I don't mean just at that moment in time. I mean the fact that the Christ being joined with earth evolution. So then we have the future transformations that are in process now, and that for some people are coming in now even. And these are the transformations of the quote unquote lower members into what are higher aspects or higher transformed versions, meaning the astral body, which is the soul body, is transformed into what Steiner called the spirit self. The etheric body is transformed into the life spirit, and the physical body into spirit man, which is the body that overcomes death. It is the spiritualization of all of these aspects, but it's the spiritualization through the I, through the spirit of the individual human being. And so all human beings have these potentials, and they have to choose to work on incarnating those potentials. I need to pause in a minute. I'm going to continue this slide and then I'll pause. Okay, Steiner's work is it's very, very voluminous. There's over 6,000 lectures. They are, frankly, very hard to understand if you haven't spent time to understand the written books. I would recommend, if you want to understand this, starting with some of the written books. The ones that I started with are called the basic books, and I should make a list of them, but they are How to Know Higher Worlds, Philosophy of Freedom, Theosophy, Esoteric Science, and Christianity as a Mystical Fact. And the books were intended for a general audience because Steiner wrote them and was able to edit them. The lectures were not intended for a general audience. At that period of time, they, of course, were not recorded. That wasn't a thing. And as far as I know, there are no recordings of Steiner's voice. They were the early lectures were compiled from notes, and then because students were circulating these lectures, Steiner started to insist that the lectures be stenographed to avoid error as much as possible. But it means that only about half of the lectures were actually stenographed, and even stenography can have errors. So really take the lectures as what they say must be understood in the broader context. And they were not intended for the public ever, but because people started distributing them, they are now in the public realm. And they were given to the specific people in the specific audience. And so sometimes there are pieces of information that might mean nothing to you or me, but might have meant something very significant to someone in the audience. On YouTube, you can find people reading these lectures out loud. So that can be a great way to listen to them. There's also, in English, rsarchive.org has many, many of the lectures. And these are numbered by topic. And those are called the GA, or Gesamtausgabe. And there's 350 something GA numbers, and within each GA number is many lectures, like 20, 30 sometimes, but they're subject matters. Now, in current media, in social media, there are two things that I've seen referenced by people who are not deeply versed in anthroposophy, but are interested in Steiner because of these things. One is the statements about vaccines and inoculation against the spirit. And if you want to go read that, it's in what is called GA 177. You can go to rsarchive.org and print out the whole thing. And then the eighth sphere, which is the way I understand it, it is this, it is probably what we would now call transhumanism. It's the digital realm is feeding into it. It is this inverted, subverted version of the earth and the human spirit. And it is being built by the adversaries, which are, the Luciferic forces and the Ahrimanic forces, in order to that they might have a place and we can feed into it or not. And for the most part, we are feeding into it because we are so immersed in technology and the trends towards transhumanism. And these things are really deep questions that then we get into the transformation of evil and redemption of evil. And these are topics that are only coming back into exoteric or mainstream Christianity at this point in time. They were made anathema and early on, and now some mainstream Christian thinkers are starting to understand that if we understand the earth as this spiritual entity and us human beings as a component of that, we actually have responsibility for transforming it, including transforming the evil aspects. going to pause this right now. I am back. I added this quote in order to show some of this idea of what it means to have the I incarnate, or to have the I that is made possible by the Christ to incarnate. And I thought it was a really interesting piece because this little line, "Becoming like little children," is often mystifying. It's easy to think it means to become innocent, but in this quote, Steiner describes it as actually becoming um, conscious of our relationship with higher forces, meaning angelic beings and higher beings. And so developing this conscious awareness is part of that process of purification, illumination, unification, or initiation. And then, just to wrap up, some definitions, but I'm not going to read these. I thought it would be nice to put them on screen. Um, the way I understand, just to speak about transhumanism, the way I understand transhumanism is it's this materialistic urge to completely disconnect the human spirit and soul from the physical body. And the inspiration, in the negative sense, the negative inspiration behind that is to thwart the human spiritual evolution and the incarnation and the spiritualization of the earth in favor of putting all that, let's call it energy or human spirit, into the eighth sphere, which is this inverted version of the earth. Let's see. And one of the questions David asked was, can we live a life of pure reason and have peace? And I was reminded recently by a friend that divine reason is the logos. Spiritual wisdom is the Sophia. And so what do we mean by pure reason? Do we mean divine reason? Can it be on that continuum? I think if we include divine reason or the logos, then yes. But I think just the lower materialistic reason is not enough. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And check out David's podcast, which I will link to if I publish this. Thanks.